Have you ever found yourself stuck in one of those arguments that feels uh, less like an actual search for the truth and a lot more like a rehearsed play?
Oh, absolutely. Like, everyone already knows their lines.
Right. We've all been there. It's like arguing with that one uncle at Thanksgiving about politics.
Yeah, that's the perfect comparison.
Nobody is actually listening. Everyone knows exactly what the other person is going to say before they even open their mouth, and you're all just waiting for your turn to deploy the exact same talking points you used last year.
Just waiting for your cue to speak.
Exactly. So today, we're taking a deep dive into an absolutely fascinating narrative excerpt. It's simply titled Stranger to PDF.
Well, very mysterious title.
It is. And our mission today is to examine this really intense philosophical encounter that completely dissects the anatomy of belief, the nature of truth, and, well, how our brains build defense mechanisms to protect our worldviews.
It's a remarkable piece of writing, and it perfectly illustrates the psychology of entrenched beliefs. Now, for those of you watching the video feed, you'll notice my backdrop has shifted a bit.
Yeah, it looks like is that a plaza?
Right, a bustling, sunlit city plaza with a large fountain right in the center. That is the stage for our story today. But before we get into the mechanics of the standoff, I want to establish some very clear ground rules for you, the listener.
Always a good idea when we're diving into
Oh,
something this intense.
exactly. Because in this deep dive, we are absolutely not taking either side of the debate you're about to hear. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the believers in the story, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the non-believers.
Right, we're staying completely neutral.
100%. The source material features highly charged religious and philosophical arguments, but our goal here is to impartially report on the content provided. We're purely analyzing the fascinating mechanics of the conversation itself. You know, the psychological traps, the cognitive dissonance.
And how human beings defend their identities when they get pushed into a corner.
Precisely.
And the endless loop these two groups are stuck in is something I think anyone can relate to, regardless of your personal worldview. So picture this plaza. It's a beautiful afternoon, and right by that fountain, two groups have been locked in a dead heat for over an hour.
Just going at it.
Yeah, just unrelenting.
Right.
On one side, you have a group arguing for Christian belief. They're making their standard case. You know, faith saves, Scripture is the Word of God, the resurrection is historical fact.
And then the other side.
Right. On the other side, a larger group of non-believers is systematically trying to dismantle that case. They argue that faith isn't evidence, Scripture is man-made, and you just can't verify ancient miracles.
It's a complete deadlock, and what's fascinating here is watching how they jump from point to point like a choreographed ritual.
Right. They just bounce around.
Exactly. The believers bring up being saved by grace, so the non-believers counter that feeling saved isn't empirical evidence. The believers pivot to biblical prophecy, and the non-believers shoot it down as circular interpretation.
And then the believers try relying on personal experience, and the non-believers just neatly categorize that away by saying personal experience isn't transferable data.
It's just back and forth, back and forth.
They even get into morality, which the non-believers efficiently separate into a totally different box from objective truth claims. It's just exhausting to even imagine being in the middle of it.
But that exhaustion is actually the point. The source uses a brilliant analogy to describe this dynamic. It notes that neither side expected to learn a single thing.
Not a single thing.
No, the conversation didn't exist to resolve the question. It compares the argument to exercising a muscle. You don't exercise a muscle to reach a physical destination, right?
Right, you do it to maintain its shape.
Exactly. You do it simply to maintain its shape. Both sides were just flexing their worldviews to keep their own cognitive frameworks intact. They're engaging in a massive display of confirmation bias, where the pushback from the other side actually reinforces their own certainty.
But that endless loop of muscle flexing is exactly what makes the next moment in the narrative so jarring.
Hey.
Because someone else has been listening this whole time.
Ah, yes. The stranger.
Right. While all this loud arguing is happening, nobody notices a man standing near the fountain. He's got his bag at his feet. And the text makes a really crucial distinction about how he's listening.
Which is so important.
He isn't waiting for his turn to jump in. He's listening the way a doctor listens to a chest.
That specific comparison is so revealing. When a doctor listens to your chest with a stethoscope, they aren't listening to the words you're saying. They're listening for the underlying mechanical function.
Right, like a wheeze or a murmur.
Or a structural flaw. This stranger isn't getting caught up in the superficial noise of grace versus evidence. He's listening for the structural integrity of the argument itself, and eventually he hears what he's looking for.
So he steps forward.
Yes, he steps forward, excuses himself, and asks if he can pose a few questions to the group.
And the way he enters the fray is so deliberate. He doesn't come in swinging or preaching. He looks at the woman leading the non-believers and asks to confirm their consensus.
He wants to establish the baseline.
Exactly. He basically asks, you've established that religious claims are matters of belief, not truth. Is that the consensus? And the man next to her proudly states that it's the conclusion of every serious intellectual discipline.
And the stranger just accepts this.
He does. He says he wants to make sure he's standing on their ground, not his own.
Which is a masterclass in debate strategy. He's establishing a shared baseline. Once they agree on the premise, they are bound by the logic that follows.
Okay, let's unpack this logic for a second, because the stranger then launches into a rapid-fire series of questions about doors, of all things.
It's a strict illogical syllogism.
Right, so he asks, can belief shut a door that truth opens? The woman answers no.
Right.
Then he asks, can belief open a door that truth shuts? Again, she says no.
And then he flips it.
Yes, he flips it. He asks, can truth shut a door that belief opens? She says yes. Can truth open a door that belief shuts? Again, yes.
And for anyone who might be rusty on their Logic 101, a syllogism is just a formal way of testing if a conclusion is valid based on agreed-upon premises. If A is true and B is true, then C must logically follow. He's boxing her in with her own rules.
I hear what you're saying about him setting a trap, but isn't he just using semantics to confuse her? She even gets annoyed at this point and calls the questions elementary.
It feels like semantics until you see where he's going. He isn't playing a word game. He's forcing her to define the absolute functional limits of truth versus the functional limits of belief.
Right.
And he springs the trap perfectly with his final question in that sequence. He asks, is there anything other than truth that can open so nothing can shut it and shut so nothing can open it?
And she pauses, but she has to answer honestly based on the logic they just locked in. She said no. Only truth has that unique property.
Exactly. She has just firmly logically agreed that only truth possesses the ultimate power to open and shut without interference. Belief cannot do that. Only truth.
And this is where the stranger drops the hammer. He quotes a verse from the Bible entirely from memory. He says, these are the words of him who is holy and true. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open.
The timing is incredible.
It is. Someone in the crowd actually doubts if it's real, but a bystander pulls out a phone, scrolls for a second, and confirms it's Revelation 3.7, word for word.
The tension in that plaza must have spiked instantly. The dilemma for the non-believers is suddenly massive. The stranger points out that the woman just logically defined the absolute properties of truth.
Yeah.
And this ancient biblical passage uses that exact same strict definition. So he asks them, is this passage describing belief or is it describing truth?
The crowd goes dead silent. The guy next to the woman tries to call it a rhetorical trick, accusing the stranger of mapping logic onto a Bible verse after the fact.
Which is a natural defense.
Sure, but the stranger pushes back. He asks if they can read the verse as being about belief. Someone from the middle of the crowd admits that no, they just established that belief can always be overridden. So the only coherent reading of that text is that it's talking about absolute truth.
The woman leading the non-believers is suddenly trapped in a logical corner. She needs a way out, so she falls back on a very common cognitive defense mechanism. She calls it a coincidence.
But does she just get away with calling it a coincidence? How does he respond to that? Because that feels like an easy out.
He absolutely does not let her hide behind the idea of a coincidence. He immediately challenges the math of that defense. He says if it's a coincidence, then coincidence has limits.
Oh, that's sharp.
It is.
Yeah.
He says if he can find another example from the exact same source that also only works through the mechanics of truth, then the probability of it being a total accident drops significantly.
Well, she agrees.
She nods, mostly because refusing the challenge would make her look like she was afraid of her own logical standards.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So he introduces something he calls Christ's dilemma. He asks the crowd if they've heard of it. Both the believers and the non-believers just give him blank looks.
Complete silence.
Which is wild when you think about it. You have two groups who have spent the entire afternoon intensely arguing about Christ, and neither side has ever even heard of the central dilemma of his story.
It perfectly highlights the muscle flexing analogy from earlier. They know their rehearsed talking points, but they don't actually know the structural depths of the material they're fighting over.
Right. So the stranger then quotes Jesus saying, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind."
Of a very heavy statement.
He lets that quote sit in the air. Then he breaks it down. He says, Christ is claiming his presence does two very specific things. It gives sight to those who do not see, and it reveals blindness in those who think they do. The stranger states that either this happens demonstrably or he is bluffing.
And this is where the stranger introduces the concept of the burden of proof. In any logical argument, the burden of proof is on the person making the claim.
Right.
If I claim I can fly, it's not your job to prove I can't. It's my job to prove I can. When the stranger sets this up, both groups completely short-circuit.
It's a total mess. They immediately retreat to their rehearsed lines. The woman says that if the only evidence is the testimony of believers, then he's bluffing. A believer instantly jumps in, tells the woman she's spiritually blind, and says followers are given sight because they are saved by faith.
And the woman fires back.
Yeah, she fires back that their position is based on blind belief, which just proves her side is right.
Notice what's happening psychologically here. As soon as a complex, unfamiliar threat is introduced, Christ's dilemma, both sides experience severe cognitive dissonance.
Their brains just can't process the new information.
Exactly. So they reach for their familiar buzzwords. The text gives this amazing visual. It says the believers reach for words like salvation and eternal life the way someone reaches for a handrail when the floor tilts. They don't even realize they're totally ignoring the actual logical problem the stranger just raised.
But the stranger cuts right through the noise. He points out that unless Christ demonstrably gives sight, the sentence holds that he is bluffing. He runs them through the logic again. Can belief give sight? The woman answers no.
Right.
Can belief take sight from someone who sees actual truth? Again, no. The stranger points out the pattern. This second statement only works if absolute truth is the engine behind it, not mere belief.
The non-believer woman starts to shift her stance a bit here. She's smart and she sees the trap closing again. She admits that two examples suggest the authors are following a consistent logical framework.
But then she deflects.
Yes, she deploys a new defense mechanism. She compares it to the Lord of the Rings.
Which, honestly, sounds like a pretty solid defense at first glance. She says you can have completely valid reasoning applied to an invented narrative, but that doesn't make the narrative real in the physical world. Just because the internal logic of Middle-earth makes sense doesn't mean Gandalf is going to walk down the street.
Sure, it's a clever deflection. But the stranger's counter is incredibly sharp. He tells her, flat out, that the Lord of the Rings does not have Christ's dilemma. The Bible does.
Right.
He agrees that the burden of proof remains on the claimant. But he points out a massive structural issue she's ignoring. Either the source text is completely ignorant of its own massive, impossible dilemma, or the source actually resolves it.
And if it resolves it.
Exactly. If it resolves it, arguing that the text is just primitive fiction becomes very difficult.
The woman pushes back, saying that just showing truth has this attribute doesn't prove Jesus actually has hidden knowledge. And the stranger replies with this line that just stops you in your tracks. He says, "You are not wrong about what you see. You can still be wrong about what you don't see."
That is such a powerful statement.
The source describes the woman's performance dropping for just a second. Her sharpness fades, and there's this unguarded moment where she realizes she's standing at the edge of something she hasn't mapped out yet.
That is the moment of genuine philosophical vulnerability. But instead of leaning into that unknown, instead of actually seeking the truth, she steps back into safety. She dismisses his point as just a nice turn of phrase that doesn't constitute hard evidence.
The stranger realizes the window of opportunity is closing. So he offers one final analogy. He asks her to imagine a door that can only be opened from one side.
Okay.
If everyone can open it, it proves nothing at all. But if only one can open it, then the act itself is the proof. The woman considers this. She admits the principle is sound in theory, but then she asks the crucial dismissive question. She asks, who opens imaginary doors?
This raises an important question because the stranger looks right at her and says, "You don't suggest we just open an imaginary door, do you?"
That question lands so hard the woman actually blinks. She has to admit, the logic they just worked through over the last 10 minutes was entirely real, even if she still desperately insists the story it points to is fiction.
This brings us to the absolute climax of the encounter. It's actually one of the believers who puts the pieces together first. He steps forward, his voice tight. He realizes the trap the stranger has just built.
Right.
He says to the stranger, "You said only one can open. You said the act identifies the writer, and now you're implying the door has just been opened." And then he asks the ultimate question, "Are you saying you are the writer?"
The stranger just looks at him,
Yeah.
and he doesn't answer. The source notes that the silence lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds. But if you've ever been in an argument that's been running at lightning speed for an hour, a 4-second pause feels like a physical weight pressing down on you.
Let's really break down the psychology of that silence, because it is the most important part of the entire deep dive. Why didn't he just say no or yes? We have to understand the concept of a binary trap in arguments.
Right. Explain how that works for someone who might not be familiar with the term.
Think of the argument as a giant hungry machine. A binary trap is when the machine offers you two choices, yes or no, and both choices are designed to feed the machine and destroy you. Ah, I see. If the stranger said, "Yes, I am the writer," he would be instantly condemned as a heretic or a lunatic. The machine eats him. If he said, "No, I'm just a guy making a point," he would be immediately dismissed as irrelevant. The machine eats his argument.
So there was no winning move.
Exactly. Any verbal answer he gave would just be consumed by the system they had built. Silence was literally the only response that didn't feed the argumentative beast.
So what does this all mean? That actually explains why the system reacted so violently to the silence. The machine couldn't tolerate being starved. The believer violently breaks the silence by shouting, "Blasphemy!"
Right.
But the text describes this beautifully. It says, the word didn't come out as a reasoned or considered theological decision. It was a physical reflex. It compares it to a body throwing its arms out when your feet slip on ice.
That's the perfect metaphor for a defense mechanism. When your mind slips on the ice of cognitive dissonance, when you are faced with something that shatters your rehearsed reality, you don't rationally process it. You desperately grab onto the nearest solid thing to keep your balance. And for this believer, the nearest solid thing was shouting blasphemy to protect his doctrine.
And the non-believer woman seizes on this chaos immediately. She finds her absolute vindication in his outburst. She points to the angry believer and tells her group, "You see, this is what happens."
She uses it as fuel.
She does. She claims that applying valid reasoning to a fictional framework always produces delusion. She uses the believer's angry reaction and the stranger's silence as empirical evidence of exactly what she'd been warning about the entire afternoon.
It's incredible how fast she buries her own contradiction. Just a minute prior, she had accepted the logical tool, but was terrified of what it revealed. Now, the believer's outburst gives her a live demonstration she can use to completely dismiss the stranger. Even the other believers chime in, saying that a real Christian would have immediately denied being the writer, and that relying on cold reason instead of surrendering to God is a mistake.
Which highlights this profound, almost tragic irony at the end of the scene. These two groups had spent the entire afternoon vehemently opposed to one another. They fundamentally disagreed on the very nature of reality. But suddenly, in the wake of the stranger's silence, they are perfectly aligned.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they aren't aligned in agreement, but they are aligned in direction. They both physically and ideologically turn their backs on the stranger.
Yes.
The woman looked at the silence and saw delusion. The believer looked at the silence and saw blasphemy. And the wildest part of human psychology is that both of them walked away feeling entirely 100% reassured in their original beliefs.
Which brings us to the core psychological takeaway of this entire narrative. The great illusion of defense mechanisms is that they do not feel like defense mechanisms when they are happening to you.
They feel like clarity.
They feel exactly like clarity. The woman felt she was seeing the world more clearly than she had 5 minutes ago. The believer felt the exact same way. They both felt a massive rush of absolute certainty. But as the text so perfectly puts it, what they were seeing clearly was just their own reflection, mistaken for the world.
It's a brilliant summation of how we protect our identities. When we are confronted with something that genuinely challenges the foundation of what we know, something that cannot be easily categorized or dismissed by our rehearsed scripts, our minds will scramble to find a familiar box to put it in, even if that means entirely misinterpreting reality to protect our sense of self.
And the way the story ends just leaves you sitting with that heavy realization. The stranger doesn't try to get the last word. He doesn't offer a final sweeping argument to win the crowd over. He just quietly picks up his bag. The text says the conversation closed around the space where he stood, the way water closes over a stone.
Wow.
He walks across the plaza, disappears into the afternoon shadow, and it's as if he had never been there at all. The ritual of the argument just swallows the moment whole, and everyone goes right back to flexing their muscles.
It truly is a remarkable exploration of how difficult it is to actually break through the rehearsed scripts we all carry around with us every single day. We'd rather be comfortably wrong than uncomfortably challenged.
We really would. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a challenge to take out into your own life this week. The next time you find yourself in a heated debate, whether it's about philosophy, a project at work, or even just whose turn it is to wash the dishes, and you suddenly feel this massive rush of absolute undeniable clarity that you are entirely right and the other person is entirely wrong.
Just pause.
Take 3 or 4 seconds of silence for yourself and ask, are you actually seeing the undeniable truth of the situation? Or has your mind just slipped on the ice and desperately grabbed onto the nearest familiar belief just to keep its balance? Keep questioning your own certainties. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.